You know who I really am, don't you? The words hung in the dusty air between them like a loaded gun, and Emma's eyes never wavered from his face as she slowly nodded. Jake's weathered hand instinctively moved toward his holster, years of survival instinct kicking in, but something in her steady gaze made him freeze. This woman who'd appeared at his remote cabin 3 days ago claiming to be lost, knew his secrets, secrets that could hang him from the nearest oak tree. Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. Then you know I can't let you leave. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a man who'd done terrible things and would do them again to protect the life he'd built in these unforgiving mountains. She lifted her chin with a defiance that sent an unexpected jolt through his chest. I'm counting on it. But let me take you back to where this all began, 3 days earlier, when Jake Morrison thought his biggest worry was whether the winter supplies would last until spring. He had no idea that a single knock on his cabin door would shatter the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his new life and around his heart. You see, some secrets are too heavy for one person to carry alone, and some women are too determined to let sleeping dogs lie. In the vast wilderness of Montana territory, where a man could disappear completely and start over, Jake had found the peace that had eluded him for 5 blood-soaked years. He'd traded his gun for an axe, his reputation for anonymity, and his past for the promise of redemption. But redemption, as Jake was about to learn, sometimes comes wearing a blue calico dress and carrying secrets of its own. The October wind howled through the pine trees surrounding his cabin, carrying with it the scent of coming snow and something else, something that made his scarred hands pause over the rabbit he was skinning. In all his months of solitude, he'd learned to read the mountain's moods like scripture, and tonight the wilderness was trying to tell him something. He just hadn't realized it was warning him that his past was about to come calling. The knock came just as the sun disappeared behind the jagged peaks, 3 sharp raps that cut through the mountain silence like gunshots. Jake Morrison's hands stilled on the leather holster he'd been mending by lamplight, every muscle in his body coiling with the familiar tension of a man who'd spent too many years looking over his shoulder. In the 8 months since he'd built this cabin in the remote Montana wilderness, no one had found him. No one even knew he existed. The knock came again, softer this time, almost hesitant. He moved to the window, careful to stay in the shadows, and peered through the rough-hewn shutter. A woman stood on his narrow porch, her dark hair escaping from a simple bun, her blue dress travel-stained and torn at the hem. She clutched a worn leather satchel against her chest like a shield, and even in the dim light, he could see she was trembling. Whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. Jake's first instinct was to ignore her, to let her move on and leave him to his self-imposed exile. He'd paid too high a price for this peace to risk it for a stranger. But as he watched, she swayed on her feet, catching herself against the doorframe, and something twisted in his chest, something he'd thought he'd buried along with his conscience 5 years ago. Against every survival instinct screaming in his head, he opened the door. "Ma'am?" He kept his voice low, neutral, his hand resting casually near his gun. "You're a long way from anywhere." She looked up at him with eyes the color of storm clouds, and he saw intelligence there, and desperation, and something else that made his blood run cold. Recognition. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, and his world tilted on its axis. "I've been looking for you." The name hit him like a physical blow. Nobody knew that name anymore. Jake Morrison had died in a hail of gunfire outside a bank in Kansas, and the man who'd walked away from that bloodbath had been very careful to stay dead. "I think you've got me confused with someone else, ma'am." The lie came easily, but her small, sad smile told him she wasn't buying it. "My name is Emma Brennan," she continued, as if he hadn't spoken. "I've traveled 800 miles to find you, and I know exactly who you are." The mountain wind chose that moment to gust through the clearing, sending dried leaves skittering across the porch and causing her to shiver violently. Jake found himself stepping aside before his brain caught up with his body. "You'd better come in," he heard himself say, cursing the stubborn streak of honor that had gotten him into trouble more times than he could count. But we're going to have ourselves a conversation about how you know that name. As she stepped past him into the warmth of his cabin, he caught the scent of lavender soap and something darker, the metallic tang of fear. Whatever had driven this woman 800 miles into the wilderness to find a dead man, it wasn't good news. And Jake Morrison had learned long ago that bad news usually came with a body count. The moment Emma Brennan stepped into his cabin, Jake knew his carefully constructed new life was about to crumble. She moved through his space with the cautious grace of someone accustomed to danger, her storm gray eyes taking in every detail. The rifle mounted above the fireplace, the maps spread across his rough-hewn table, the subtle way he positioned himself between her and the door. When her gaze lingered on the leather-bound journal where he'd been documenting his supplies, he resisted the urge to slam it shut. Coffee? He needed something to do with his hands, something to keep from reaching for his gun while he figured out how much trouble he was in. Please, she settled onto the wooden chair by his fireplace, but he noticed she chose the seat that gave her a clear view of both the door and the single window. Smart woman, or dangerous one. As he poured the bitter brew from the pot that perpetually simmered on his stove, Jake studied her reflection in the window glass. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25, with the kind of refined features that spoke of Eastern education and better circumstances than her worn dress suggested. But it was her hands that caught his attention. Soft palms marked by recent calluses, fingernails broken and dirt-stained. This woman was running from something, just like he was. How did you find me? He handed her the tin cup, careful not to let their fingers touch. Emma wrapped her hands around the warm metal and took a sip, buying herself time. Your brother Daniel told me where to look. The cup nearly slipped from Jake's suddenly nerveless fingers. Daniel was dead, had been dead for 3 years, killed in the same botched robbery that had finally convinced Jake to abandon his outlaw life. He'd been the one to bury his younger brother in an unmarked grave outside Tombstone, had been the one to swear over that cold ground that the Morrison brothers were finished with violence. That's impossible. His voice came out rougher than intended. Daniel's been dead since the merchant's bank job in Arizona Territory, October 15th, 1887. Emma's voice was gentle but relentless. He died in your arms after taking 2 bullets meant for you. The coffee cup hit the floor with a metallic clang, dark liquid spreading across the worn planks. Jake's hand moved to his gun without conscious thought, but Emma didn't flinch. I was there, Mr. Morrison. She set down her own cup with deliberate care, hidden behind the water trough across the street, watching my fiancé lead a posse that was supposed to capture the Morrison brothers alive. The world seemed to slow around him. Jake remembered that day with crystalline clarity, the taste of dust and gunpowder, the weight of Daniel's body growing heavier in his arms, the thunder of hoofbeats as the posse closed in. But he'd been focused on escape, on survival. He hadn't noticed a woman watching from the shadows. Your fiancé. The pieces were starting to form a picture he didn't like. He was wearing a badge. Emma nodded, and something in her expression made his blood run cold. Sheriff Thomas Brennan. He promised me you'd be taken alive, tried for your crimes in a proper court. He lied. Jake's hand had found his gun now, though he didn't remember drawing it. What do you want from me? For the first time since she'd arrived, Emma's composure cracked. Her hands shook as she reached into her satchel and withdrew a bundle of papers tied with a faded ribbon. I want you to help me prove that Sheriff Thomas Brennan murdered 3 innocent men to steal their land claims, she whispered. And I want you to help me make sure he never hurts anyone else again. The papers scattered across his table as she untied the ribbon. Bank documents, property deeds, correspondence in a familiar scrawling handwriting. Jake's blood turned to ice as he recognized his brother's careful script documenting dates, names, and locations. Daniel hadn't just been riding with him those last months. He'd been investigating, and now this woman was asking Jake to finish what his brother had died trying to prove. Emma watched Jake's face transform as he rifled through Daniel's papers, seeing the exact moment when understanding hit him like a physical blow. Son of a bitch, he breathed, holding up a letter in his brother's handwriting. Danny was trying to clear our names. The documents told a story that made Emma's stomach churn even now, weeks after she'd first discovered them hidden in her late fiancé's safe. Three separate homestead families, the Kellys, the Martinez clan, and the Wheelers, had filed legal claims on prime grazing land outside Tombstone. Within 6 months, all three families had been found dead, their claims transferred to a shell company that led directly back to Thomas Brennan. Your brother suspected something when the second family turned up murdered, Emma explained, watching Jake trace Daniel's careful notes with one scarred finger. He started documenting everything, meeting with survivors, collecting evidence, building a case. Jake's laugh was bitter. And I thought he was just getting soft, talking about going straight. He looked up at her with eyes that held 5 years' worth of guilt. I kept pushing him to do one more job, one last score before we disappeared for good. The bank job was supposed to be his final piece of evidence. Emma leaned forward, desperate to make him understand. Daniel arranged for your gang to rob Brennan's personal account because he'd traced the blood money there. He was going to use your reputation as cover while he gathered the proof he needed. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of logs in the fireplace. Outside, the October wind had picked up, rattling the shutters and sending an owl calling through the darkness. But Brennan found out. Jake's voice was flat, dead. That's why the posse was ready for us. That's why Danny died. Emma nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. She'd loved Thomas once, had planned to build a life with him in their little adobe house on the edge of town. Discovering the truth about the man she'd almost married had shattered something inside her that might never heal. I found these papers after Thomas was killed last month, she continued, shot down in the street by a drifter who claimed Thomas had cheated him at cards. But the timing was too convenient, the witnesses too eager to corroborate the stranger's story. Jake's head snapped up. You think someone silenced him? I think Thomas got greedy, started demanding a bigger cut from whoever was really behind the land grab scheme. Emma pulled out another document, a bank transfer dated just 2 weeks before Thomas's death. This payment came from someone with enough power to make sheriffs disappear when they became inconvenient. The paper bore an official seal and a signature that made Jake curse under his breath. Senator Morrison. No relation, I hope? Emma's attempt at levity fell flat. Worse. Jake stood abruptly, pacing to the window to stare out into the darkness. He's the bastard who put a bounty on my head that was big enough to buy half of Arizona territory. $5,000 dead or alive. Emma felt the blood drain from her face. $5,000 was more money than most people saw in a lifetime. No wonder Jake had run so far to escape his past. The senator owns half the territorial legislature, Jake continued grimly. If he's behind this land scheme, going up against him is suicide. Maybe. Emma stood as well, moving to stand beside him at the window. But doing nothing means more innocent families die, and Daniel's sacrifice meant nothing. In the reflection of the glass, she saw Jake's jaw tighten. Whatever else he was, she was learning that Jake Morrison was a man haunted by the weight of choices. Choices that had cost him his brother, his freedom, and any chance at the kind of life other men took for granted. There's something else, she said quietly. The drifter who killed Thomas, he had a distinctive scar across his left palm, shaped like a lightning bolt. Jake's entire body went rigid. Marcus Delacroix. The way he said the name, with the kind of recognition reserved for old enemies, sent ice through Emma's veins. She was beginning to realize that finding Jake Morrison might have been the easy part. The name Marcus Delacroix hung in the air between them like a curse, and Emma watched Jake's knuckles whiten as his hands clenched into fists. You know him. It wasn't a question. Jake turned away from the window, and in the firelight, she could see the network of scars that crisscrossed his forearms, old wounds that spoke of violence and survival. Marcus and I have history, bad history. He moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin, withdrawing a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. The amber liquid caught the light as he poured, and Emma noticed his hands were perfectly steady, despite the tension radiating from every line of his body. Marcus Delacroix used to ride with the Comancheros down in New Mexico territory, Jake said, handing her a glass. Gun for hire, specializes in making problems disappear permanently. If Senator Morrison hired him to clean up loose ends, Then Thomas wasn't the first to die, and he won't be the last. Emma accepted the whiskey but didn't drink, using the moment to study Jake's face. There was something he wasn't telling her, something that made his gray eyes go dark and distant. "How do you know so much about his methods?" she pressed. Jake's smile was sharp as a blade. "Because 5 years ago, Marcus was hired to kill me." The confession hung between them while the fire popped and hissed, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Outside, the wind had grown stronger, whistling through the pine trees with a sound like distant screams. What happened? Emma found herself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite herself. The Morrison brothers had just hit a silver shipment outside Santa Fe, biggest score of our careers. But someone had tipped off the territorial marshal, and we were riding straight into an ambush. Jake took a long swallow of whiskey before continuing. Marcus was waiting in the rocks above Devil's Canyon with a rifle and orders to make sure neither of us made it out alive. Emma could picture it, two brothers riding hard through hostile territory, unaware that death was watching from the cliffs above. "But you survived." "Danny saved my life." Jake's voice went rough. He spotted the glint of sunlight on Marcus's rifle barrel just as he was taking the shot, threw himself between the bullet and me. The same guilt that had been eating at Jake for 3 years was written across his features now, plain as ink on paper. Emma felt something twist in her chest, an unexpected sympathy for this man who carried his brother's death like a physical weight. "The bullet was meant for your heart," she said quietly. Instead, it caught Danny in the shoulder, and we both went over the canyon wall with our horses. Jake stared into his glass as if he could read the future in the amber depths. "Took us 2 days to climb out of that hellhole, and by then Marcus had reported us dead and collected his fee. But now he's working for the same man who wants you dead." Emma set down her untouched whiskey, her mind racing through the implications. "Jake, if Senator Morrison knows you're alive, he'll send Marcus to finish the job." Jake's interruption was grim. "And this time, I don't have Danny to watch my back." Emma stood abruptly, pacing to the fireplace where she stared into the flames. Everything about this situation was spiraling beyond what she'd anticipated when she'd started her desperate journey into the mountains. She'd come looking for justice for the murdered families, for closure regarding Daniel's death, for some way to honor the brother who died trying to do the right thing. She hadn't expected to find herself protecting the life of an outlaw who might be the only person capable of exposing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. "There's still the evidence," she said finally. "Daniel's documentation, the bank records, the property transfers. It's enough to prove what really happened to those families. Evidence is only useful if you live long enough to present it to someone who gives a damn." Jake moved to stand beside her, and she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Senator Morrison owns judges, marshals, half the territorial legislature. Who exactly did you plan to tell this story to?" The question she'd been avoiding for weeks finally demanded an answer. Emma reached into her satchel and withdrew a letter bearing an official federal seal. "A United States Marshal named Cole Harrison," she said quietly. "He's been investigating territorial corruption for the past year, and according to this letter, he's very interested in anything related to Senator Morrison's business dealings." Jake examined the letter, his expression unreadable. "You've been in contact with a federal marshal?" "I wrote to him after I found Daniel's papers. He responded 3 weeks ago asking me to bring any evidence I discovered to a meeting in Denver." Emma met Jake's eyes, seeing her own desperation reflected there. "The meeting is scheduled for next week." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind howling around the cabin and the crack of burning wood. Then Jake smiled, a real smile, the first she'd seen from him. "Well then," he said, reaching for his gun belt, "I guess we'd better make sure you get to Denver alive." The decision to trust Emma Brennan went against every survival instinct Jake had developed in his years as an outlaw. But as he strapped on his gun belt the next morning, he realized he had already made his choice the moment she'd spoken Daniel's name. "We'll leave at first light," he told her, rolling his few possessions into a worn bedroll. "Stay off the main trails, move fast, and pray Marcus doesn't pick up our track before we reach Denver." Emma watched him prepare for their journey with quiet efficiency, loading supplies into saddlebags with the practiced movements of a man who'd spent years running from trouble. She'd already proven she could handle herself. When he'd offered her Daniel's old bedroll, she'd simply nodded and begun organizing her own meager belongings without complaint. "How long will it take us to reach Denver?" she asked, checking the loads in the small revolver she'd withdrawn from her satchel. Jake paused in his packing, surprised by her competence with the weapon. "5 days if we push hard and the weather holds. Maybe 7 if we run into trouble." "We'll run into trouble." Emma's matter-of-fact tone made him look up sharply. "Marcus Delacroix isn't the only one hunting us now. When I left Tombstone, there were 2 other men asking questions about a woman traveling alone with a leather satchel." The cold knot of dread in Jake's stomach tightened. "What kind of men?" "The expensive kind, clean-shaven, good clothes, guns worn like they knew how to use them." Emma met his eyes across the cabin. "They were offering $50 to anyone who could point them in the right direction." $50 was more than most men made in 2 months. Senator Morrison was clearly serious about recovering Daniel's evidence and eliminating anyone who'd seen it. "Then we leave now," Jake decided, shouldering his pack. "Before full daylight gives them an advantage." They slipped out of the cabin like ghosts, leading their horses through the pre-dawn darkness until they were well clear of the clearing. Jake had chosen his hiding place carefully when he'd built the cabin: 3 different escape routes through terrain too rough for pursuit on horseback, water sources hidden in deep ravines, and enough elevation to spot trouble coming from miles away. As they mounted up and began their descent toward the valley floor, Emma surprised him again. "Tell me about Marcus," she said quietly. "If we're going to face him, I need to know how he thinks." Jake guided his horse around a fallen log, buying himself time to organize memories he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. "Marcus isn't like other gun hands. He's patient, methodical, won't take a shot unless he's certain of the kill." "What's his weakness?" The question was so practical, so coldly strategic, that Jake found himself reassessing the woman riding beside him. Emma Brennan was turning out to be far more than the desperate widow he'd first assumed. "Pride," he said finally. "Marcus takes jobs personally. When Danny and I survived Devil's Canyon, it wasn't just a failed contract. It was an insult to his reputation." They rode in silence for an hour, following a game trail that wound through stands of aspen and pine. The October air was crisp with the promise of snow, and Jake could smell the change coming in the wind. Winter was early this year, which could work for or against them depending on timing. It was Emma who spotted the first sign of pursuit. "Smoke," she said quietly, pointing toward a thin gray column rising from the valley behind them. "Too much for a campfire, too controlled for a wildfire." Jake pulled out his field glasses, studying the distant smoke with growing unease. "They're burning my cabin." The words hit him harder than he'd expected. That cabin had represented something precious. A chance at redemption. A life built with his own hands. Proof that Jake Morrison could be more than just another outlaw running from his past. "I'm sorry," Emma said, and the genuine sympathy in her voice surprised him. It was just wood and stone. The lie came easily, but he could see in her expression that she didn't believe it any more than he did. They pushed their horses harder after that, following ridgelines and creek beds, staying under cover whenever possible. By noon, they'd put 15 miles between themselves and the smoke, but Jake's unease was growing rather than diminishing. Marcus Delacroix was out there somewhere, methodically following their trail. And unlike 5 years ago, this time Jake didn't have his brother watching his back. As they paused to water their horses at a hidden spring, Emma touched his arm. "We're going to make it to Denver," she said firmly. "Daniel's sacrifice is going to mean something." Jake wanted to believe her, but as he scanned the surrounding hills for signs of pursuit, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were riding straight into the same kind of trap that had killed his brother. Some debts, he was beginning to realize, could never be fully paid. By the 3rd day of hard riding, Emma was beginning to understand why Jake Morrison had survived so long as an outlaw. He moved through the wilderness like smoke, reading tracks and weather signs with an expertise that bordered on supernatural. "Storm coming," he announced, studying the iron-gray clouds building along the northern horizon. "We need shelter, and we need it before nightfall." They'd been following a narrow canyon for the past 2 hours, their horses picking their way carefully along a rocky trail that would challenge even experienced mountain climbers. Emma's legs ached from the constant tension of staying in the saddle, but she'd be damned before she'd slow them down by complaining. There, Jake pointed toward a dark opening in the canyon wall, barely visible behind a screen of juniper bushes. Cave system. I used it 3 years ago when I was mapping escape routes. As they approached the hidden entrance, Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. "You've been planning this life for 3 years? Longer?" Jake dismounted and began leading his horse through the narrow opening. "Been planning it since the day Danny died. Took me 2 years to find the right place, another year to build the cabin and lay in supplies." The cave was larger than it appeared from outside, a natural limestone formation that stretched back into darkness, with enough space near the entrance for their horses and gear. Jake moved with practiced efficiency, hobbling the animals and gathering deadwood for a fire. "Tell me about the federal marshal," he said as they settled around the small blaze. "Cole Harrison. What makes you think we can trust him?" Emma withdrew the letter from her satchel, smoothing the creases carefully. "He's been building cases against territorial corruption for 18 months. 3 successful prosecutions, including a land commissioner and 2 county sheriffs. All small fish." Jake's skepticism was evident. "Going after Senator Morrison is different. That's the kind of move that ends careers. Or lives." "Maybe." Emma stared into the flames, remembering the careful tone of Harrison's letter. But he specifically mentioned having sources inside Morrison's organization. Someone's been feeding him information. The implication hung between them like smoke from the fire. If Harrison had an informant close to the senator, then their mission might actually have a chance of success. Outside, the wind was picking up, whistling through the canyon with a sound like distant voices. Jake moved to the cave entrance, peering out at the darkening sky. "We'll hole up here tonight," he decided. "Push hard tomorrow and try to reach the main trail before—" The crack of a rifle shot echoed through the canyon, followed immediately by the whine of a bullet ricocheting off stone near the cave entrance. Jake threw himself backward as a second shot shattered the silence, this one close enough that Emma felt the wind of its passage. In one fluid motion, he'd drawn his Colt and blown out their fire, plunging them into darkness. "Marcus?" Emma whispered, her own gun already in her hand. "Has to be." Jake's voice was grimly calm. "He's got us pinned in here, and with this storm coming, we can't wait him out." Another shot rang out, this one aimed at their horses. Jake cursed as his mount screamed and went down, blood spreading across the cave floor. "He's trying to strand us," Emma realized, "make us easier targets when we try to run." The methodical nature of the attack was chilling. Marcus wasn't shooting to kill. Not yet. He was systematically eliminating their options, forcing them into a position where they'd have no choice but to surrender or die fighting. "There's another way out," Jake said suddenly. "Back tunnel leads to a ledge about 50 feet up the canyon wall. Dangerous climb, but it puts us above his position." Emma nodded in the darkness, trusting his knowledge of the terrain. "What about the evidence?" "Take it with us. If we don't make it to Denver, we're making it to Denver." Her interruption was fierce. "Daniel didn't die so we could give up in some cave." Jake's soft chuckle surprised her. "You know, you remind me of him sometimes. Same stubborn streak, same refusal to back down from a fight." They moved deeper into the cave, following Jake's lead through passages barely wide enough for their shoulders. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the distant flicker of lightning beginning to play across the sky outside. "There," Jake whispered, pointing toward a faint gray patch ahead. "Exit's about 10 feet up. I'll boost you, then follow." As Emma prepared to climb, another rifle shot echoed through the canyon, followed by Marcus's voice calling through the growing storm. "Morrison, I know you're in there. Come out now, and I'll make it quick for both of you." Jake's response was to chamber a round in his rifle with a sound that carried clearly through the cave system. "Come and get us, Marcus. But remember what happened last time you tried to collect that bounty." The challenge was delivered with the kind of cold confidence that made Emma understand why the Morrison brothers had been legendary throughout the territories. Whatever Jake had been in his outlaw days, he hadn't been a man who backed down from a fight. As thunder began to roll across the canyon and the first drops of rain started to fall, Emma realized their war with Senator Morrison was about to become very personal indeed. Rain turned the narrow ledge into a death trap, but it was still preferable to being pinned down in the cave while Marcus Delacroix picked them off at his leisure. Emma pressed herself against the wet stone 50 feet above the canyon floor, while Jake worked his way along the precarious outcropping toward a position that would give him a clear shot at their pursuer. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene below in stark black and white. Marcus's horse tethered in the trees, the gunman himself positioned behind a boulder that commanded the cave entrance. "He's been watching us for hours," Jake whispered when another lightning flash revealed the careful positioning of Marcus's gear. "Probably followed our smoke yesterday, then waited for the perfect spot to pin us down." The methodical patience was exactly what Jake had warned her about. Marcus Delacroix wasn't just a killer, he was a hunter who understood that the best traps were the ones prey walked into willingly. "Can you get a shot from here?" Emma asked, wiping rain from her eyes. Jake studied the angle, calculating distances and obstacles. "Maybe, but if I miss, he'll know exactly where we are." Another rifle shot cracked through the storm, this one aimed at the shadows near the cave entrance. Marcus was being thorough, making sure they couldn't slip out under cover of the rain. "Morrison!" The gunman's voice carried clearly despite the wind. "Senator sends his regards. Says to tell you he never forgets a debt." The personal message confirmed what Emma had suspected. This wasn't just about eliminating witnesses. For Senator Morrison, Jake's survival represented an insult that demanded personal satisfaction. "Jake," she said quietly, an idea forming. "What if we don't try to fight him?" He looked at her as if she'd suggested they sprout wings and fly. "Run how? He's got our horses, knows the terrain, and can track us in his sleep." "Not run. Negotiate." The word hung in the air between them while lightning painted the canyon walls silver. Jake's expression was incredulous, but Emma pressed on. "Marcus is a professional. This job pays him whether we're alive or dead, right? What if we offered him something better?" "Like what? I've got maybe $50 and a used saddle." Emma reached into her satchel, withdrawing a document she'd kept separate from Daniel's evidence. "Like this." Even in the dim light, Jake could see the official seals and signatures that marked the paper as something important. "What is it?" "A territorial land grant, 40,000 acres of prime grazing land in Colorado Territory, signed over to Thomas Brennan as payment for services rendered." Emma's smile was sharp as broken glass. Services that included murdering innocent families and covering up Senator Morrison's crimes. The implications were staggering. 40,000 acres represented wealth beyond anything a hired gun could expect to earn in a lifetime of contracts. It was the kind of score that could set a man up for life if he was smart enough to take it. "You think Marcus will betray Morrison for a piece of paper?" Jake asked. "I think Marcus is smart enough to know that Morrison will eventually tie up loose ends by killing him too." Emma carefully folded the document and tucked it away. "And I think 40,000 acres is worth more than whatever bounty Morrison put on our heads." Before Jake could respond, Marcus's voice cut through the storm again. Closer this time. "I'm coming up there, Morrison. Easy way or hard way, your choice." Jake peered over the ledge, spotting movement in the shadows below. Marcus was indeed making his way up the canyon wall, using handholds and ledges with the sure-footed confidence of a man comfortable with dangerous climbs. "He'll be in rifle range in 5 minutes, Jake muttered. "If you're going to try negotiating, better do it now." Emma cupped her hands around her mouth, calling down through the rain. "Marcus Delacroix, I have a business proposition for you." The climbing stopped. In the sudden silence, she could hear nothing but wind and rain and the distant rumble of thunder. "You've got 30 seconds, lady." Marcus's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "Then I start shooting again." 40,000 acres of territorial land, legally signed and witnessed," Emma called back. "Worth more than Morrison's ever paid you for a single contract." The silence stretched longer this time. When Marcus finally responded, his tone had changed subtly, professional interest replacing predatory hunger. "You offering me a bribe?" "I'm offering you a retirement plan," Emma replied, "before Morrison decides you know too much and hires someone else to hunt you." Jake was staring at her with something approaching admiration. "You realize if this doesn't work, we're both dead in about 3 minutes?" Emma checked the loads in her revolver, her hands steady despite the situation. "Then we'd better hope Marcus Delacroix is as smart as you think he is." From below came the sound of boots on stone, but whether Marcus was climbing toward them or retreating to consider her offer, neither of them could tell. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, broken only by the steady drumbeat of rain on stone and the distant rumble of thunder moving through the canyon. When Marcus finally spoke again, his voice came from directly below their ledge. "Show me the papers," he called up. "And don't try anything clever. I've got you both in my sights." Emma looked at Jake, who nodded grimly. Slowly, she withdrew the land grant from her satchel, holding it where the lightning would illuminate the official seals and signatures. "Territorial's seal looks genuine," Marcus admitted after a long moment. "But how do I know Morrison won't just void the transfer once he finds out?" "Because Morrison's dead." The lie came smoothly, confidently, and Emma saw Jake's eyes widen in surprise. "Killed 2 days ago by federal marshals acting on evidence we provided. This land grant is all that's left of his operation." It was a desperate gamble, but Emma had spent enough time with Thomas to understand how men like Marcus thought. They were survivors first, killers second, and survival meant recognizing when the political winds had shifted. "Bullshit," Marcus called, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "I would have heard about something that big." "Check the territorial capital when you get back to civilization," Emma replied. "Or don't, and spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder for the next gunman Morrison sends after you." The psychology was sound. Marcus had to know that his current employer viewed hired guns as disposable assets. In Morrison's world, dead men told no tales and former employees represented potential liabilities. "Let's say I believe you," Marcus said finally. "What exactly are you proposing?" Jake leaned close to Emma's ear. "Whatever you're planning, do it fast. This storm's getting worse, and hypothermia will kill us just as dead as his bullets." Emma raised her voice against the wind. "Simple trade. You let us ride out of here, and the land grant is yours. Clean deed, territorial backing, 40,000 acres of prime Colorado grazing land. And if I just take it from your dead bodies, then you get a worthless piece of paper." Emma's tone was matter of fact. "The grant requires my signature to complete the transfer. Kill me, and it reverts to territorial ownership." It was another lie, but a convincing one. Legal documents in the territories were complex enough that most people, including professional killers, wouldn't know the specific requirements for property transfers. Lightning split the sky again, and in its brief illumination, Emma saw Marcus on a ledge about 20 feet below them, his rifle trained upward, but not immediately threatening. He was thinking, weighing options, calculating odds. "How do I know you won't just ride to the nearest marshal and report me for attempted murder?" he asked. Jake spoke for the first time since the negotiation began. "Because we're wanted too, Marcus. Emma for stealing evidence from a dead sheriff, me for being Jake Morrison. We disappear just as fast as you do." The admission of their fugitive status seemed to convince Marcus more than any amount of legal documentation. In his world, mutual criminality was a stronger bond than contracts or promises. "All right," he called finally, "but we do this smart. You come down here, we examine the papers together, and we all ride away like civilized people." Emma felt Jake tense beside her. "It's a trap," he whispered, "the moment we're in range." "Maybe," Emma interrupted, "but it's also our only chance." She was already moving, working her way carefully along the ledge toward a section where the descent looked manageable. The rock was slick with rain, and one wrong step would send her tumbling 50 feet to the canyon floor. But staying on the ledge meant freezing to death before morning. Jake followed reluctantly, his gun drawn but not immediately threatening. As they climbed down, Emma could see Marcus repositioning himself to keep them in sight, his own weapon ready but not aimed. The moment of truth came when they reached the canyon floor, all three of them within easy shooting distance of each other. Marcus was exactly what she'd expected. Lean, scarred, with the kind of pale eyes that had seen too much death. His gun was steady in his hand, but his finger wasn't on the trigger. "Papers," he said simply. Emma withdrew the land grant, holding it where he could see the details but not quite within reach. "Your word that you'll honor the agreement." Marcus studied the document, his lips moving slightly as he read the legal language. After a long moment, he holstered his gun. "Deal," he said. "But if this is some kind of setup—" "It's not." Emma handed over the papers, watching as Marcus tucked them carefully inside his coat. "Question is, what are you going to tell Morrison when he asks about us?" Marcus's smile was cold as winter steel. "I'm going to tell him Jake Morrison died in a cave-in during the storm, along with the woman who was helping him." As he mounted his horse and disappeared into the rain-lashed darkness, Emma realized they just bought their lives with a lie that would only hold as long as it took Marcus to reach civilization and discover that Senator Morrison was very much alive. But sometimes, Jake reflected, as they retrieved their surviving horse and prepared to continue their desperate journey, a temporary reprieve was better than no reprieve at all. 2 days after their encounter with Marcus Delacroix, Emma was beginning to think they might actually reach Denver alive, until she spotted the dust cloud on the horizon that meant fresh pursuit. "How many?" Jake asked, adjusting his field glasses as they crested a low ridge overlooking the Colorado plains. "4 riders, maybe 5. Emma squinted against the afternoon sun. "Moving fast, staying to our trail." They'd been sharing Jake's surviving horse since the cave, riding double, and switching off on foot to keep the animal from foundering under their combined weight. It was grueling travel, but they'd managed to cover nearly 30 miles since leaving the canyon. Jake lowered the glasses, his expression grim. Marcus must have discovered that Morrison's still breathing, or Morrison got suspicious when his hired gun didn't report in. The thought that had been nagging at Emma for the past day finally crystallized into certainty. "Jake, what if Marcus never intended to honor our deal? What if this was always part of the plan?" The possibility hit him like a physical blow. Marcus Delacroix was exactly the kind of professional who would see multiple angles to every situation, taking the land grant, letting them escape, then leading pursuit to their exact location. It was the sort of complex strategy that maximized profit while minimizing personal risk. "Son of a bitch played us," Jake admitted. "Probably sent word to Morrison the moment he was clear of the canyon." Emma checked their remaining ammunition, 12 rounds for Jake's Colt, 8 for her revolver, and perhaps 20 rifle cartridges, if they were careful. Against 5 mounted pursuers with fresh horses and unlimited supplies, it wouldn't be enough for a sustained fight. "How far to Denver?" she asked. 15 miles, maybe 20. Jake studied the terrain ahead, rolling grassland broken by occasional creek beds and stands of cottonwood trees. "But they'll catch us long before we reach the city limits." The math was brutal but simple. Their exhausted horse couldn't outrun fresh mounts, and traveling on foot would only make them easier targets. They needed a different strategy, something that would level the playing field or eliminate it entirely. "There," Emma pointed toward a line of trees that marked a creek about 2 miles ahead. "We make our stand in the cover, force them to come to us on foot." Jake nodded slowly. "Better than dying in the open, but Mama, if this goes bad—" "It won't." Her interruption was fierce, determined. "Daniel's evidence reaches Marshal Harrison, period." They pushed their tired horse hard for the next hour, covering the distance to the creek line as the dust cloud behind them grew larger and more distinct. By the time they reached the trees, Emma could make out individual riders, 4 men with the look of professional manhunters, armed and dangerous. The creek bed provided excellent defensive positions, fallen logs for cover, clear fields of fire in multiple directions, and water for their horse. Jake positioned himself on the south bank while Emma took the north, giving them overlapping lines of sight. "Remember," Jake called quietly as the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, "these aren't cowboys or farmers. They're killers, and they won't hesitate to shoot a woman." Emma checked her revolver one final time, thinking of Daniel Morrison dying in a dusty street for trying to do the right thing, of the innocent families murdered for their land claims, of Thomas Brennan's corruption finally catching up with him. "Good," she replied, "because I won't hesitate to shoot back." The first rider appeared through the trees at a full gallop, clearly expecting to overrun their position before they could organize a defense. Jake's rifle spoke with authority, dropping the man from his saddle in a tumble of arms and legs. The other 3 pulled up short, dismounting and seeking cover as bullets began flying in both directions. Emma's first shot took bark from a cottonwood inches from one pursuer's head, causing him to dive for better protection. "Morrison!" one of the gunmen called through the smoke. Senator says to tell you he's tired of playing games. Surrender now and the woman doesn't have to die hard. Jake's response was another rifle shot that sent splinters flying from the log the speaker was hiding behind. Tell the senator to go to hell. The firefight settled into a deadly pattern, short bursts of concentrated fire followed by tense periods of silence, as each side tried to maneuver for better positions. Emma counted shots carefully, knowing that every cartridge had to count. It was during one of these quiet moments that she heard it, the distant whistle of a train approaching from the east. "Jake," she called, "the railway!" He caught her meaning immediately. The Denver and Rio Grande line ran within half a mile of their position, and a northbound train meant civilization, witnesses, and the possibility of reaching Marshall Harrison alive. "Cover me," Emma said, already moving toward her horse. "I'm going to flag down that train." "Emma, wait." But she was already spurring the exhausted animal toward the railway embankment, betting everything on a desperate race against time and bullets. Behind her, Jake's rifle began speaking as fast as he could work the lever, laying down covering fire against odds that were about to become impossible. The locomotive's whistle grew louder as Emma urged her exhausted horse up the railway embankment, bullets whining overhead from the gunman Jake was holding at bay in the creek bed. 50 yards. The train was still too far away, moving too fast to stop in time even if the engineer spotted her. Emma pulled off her blue shawl, waving it frantically while steering her mount directly onto the tracks. 30 yards. The engineer's horn blasted a warning, "Mama mia" warning. But the massive locomotive showed no signs of slowing. Emma could see the man in the cab now, leaning out to get a better look at the obstacle on his rails. Behind her, Jake's rifle had gone silent. Either he was out of ammunition or the gunman had flanked his position. Either way, she was running out of time and options. 20 yards. The locomotive's brakes screamed against steel rails, but physics and momentum weren't on her side. Emma threw herself from the saddle just as the train's cowcatcher swept her horse aside like a discarded toy. The impact sent her rolling down the embankment in a tangle of skirts and flying elbows, Daniel's precious evidence scattering from her torn satchel. As she struggled to her feet, Emma saw one of Morrison's gunmen breaking from the tree line, rifle raised and aimed directly at her heart. The shot that dropped him came from an unexpected direction. The train itself. A figure in a dark coat and federal badge had appeared on the locomotive's running board, smoking rifle in his hands. "Federal Marshal," the man shouted over the hiss of escaping steam. "Everyone drop your weapons and surrender." More men were emerging from the passenger cars now, all armed, all wearing badges. Emma felt her knees go weak with relief as she realized what she was seeing. Marshal Cole Harrison and a full federal posse, traveling north on official business. Jake appeared at the top of the embankment, his hands raised but his gun still holstered. The remaining two gunmen had vanished back into the creek bed, apparently deciding that discretion was the better part of valor when facing federal agents. "Marshal Harrison," Emma called, gathering Daniel's scattered papers with shaking hands. The federal officer climbed down from the train, a tall man with steel gray hair and the kind of weathered face that came from years of hunting dangerous men across dangerous country. His badge caught the afternoon sunlight as he approached. "Miss Brennan, I presume." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You certainly know how to make an entrance." "The evidence," Emma gasped, thrusting the documents toward him. Everything Daniel Morrison collected about Senator Morrison's land scheme. The murdered families, the cover-up. "Slow down," Harrison said gently, accepting the papers. "You're safe now, both of you." Jake approached cautiously, clearly uncertain of his reception. Federal marshals didn't usually express fondness for reformed outlaws, even ones trying to do the right thing. "Mr. Morrison," Harrison said, surprising them both by extending his hand. "I was hoping to meet you." Jake stared at the offered handshake. "Marshal, I think you've got me confused with someone else. I'm Jake Morrison, former member of the Morrison Brothers gang, currently living under the name Jacob Mills in a cabin approximately 60 miles northeast of here." Harrison's smile was slight but genuine. "Did you really think federal law enforcement wasn't aware of your activities?" The revelation hit Jake like cold water. "You've been watching me. For 8 months, ever since you built that cabin and started your new life." Harrison gestured toward the train. Gentlemen, why don't we continue this conversation in more comfortable surroundings? As they climbed aboard the federal car, Emma felt the weight of 3 weeks' desperate flight finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. But Harrison's next words reminded her that their troubles were far from over. Mr. Morrison, you should know that Senator Morrison put a $5,000 bounty on your head yesterday. Dead or alive, every gunman and bounty hunter in 3 territories will be looking for you within the week. Jake's laugh was bitter. So even if we prove he's a murderer and a thief, I still end up dead. Not necessarily. Harrison spread Daniel's documents across a table, studying them with professional interest. These papers, combined with testimony from both of you, should be enough to bring federal charges against Morrison and his associates. Conspiracy, murder, fraud. We're talking about life imprisonment or the gallows. Should be enough, Emma repeated. But will it be? Harrison met her eyes directly, and she saw something there that made her blood run cold. Uncertainty. Senator Morrison has friends in Washington, Miss Brennan. Powerful friends. Building a case against him will require ironclad evidence and federal protection for everyone involved. The train whistle sounded again as they picked up speed toward Denver, but Emma realized their real journey was just beginning. 6 months later, Emma Brennan stood in the witness box of the federal courthouse in Denver, watching Senator Morrison's face as she delivered the testimony that would finally bring justice for Daniel Morrison and the murdered Homestead families. The trial had been everything Marshall Harrison had predicted, a brutal legal battle between federal prosecutors and the best defense attorneys money could buy. Morrison's political connections had initially seemed insurmountable, but Daniel's meticulous documentation had proven devastating under the harsh light of federal scrutiny. And you're certain this signature belongs to Senator Morrison? The prosecutor asked, holding up one of Daniel's carefully preserved documents. Absolutely, Emma replied, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. I witnessed him sign that transfer order in Sheriff Brennan's office 3 weeks before the Kelly family was murdered. In the gallery, Jake Morrison sat with Marshall Harrison, both men armed despite the federal protection surrounding the courthouse. The bounty on Jake's head had indeed attracted every gunman and opportunist in the territories, making normal life impossible. But Harrison had offered him something unexpected, a chance to work as a federal informant, using his outlaw contacts to help bring down other criminal organizations. It wasn't the quiet redemption Jake had hoped for when he'd built his cabin in the mountains, but it was honest work, and it honored his brother's memory in a way that hiding could never accomplish. The defense attorney rose for cross-examination, a small, sharp-faced man who'd built his career on destroying prosecution witnesses. Miss Brennan, isn't it true that you stole these documents from a dead man's safe, that you've committed multiple felonies in your quest for revenge? Yes, Emma answered without hesitation. I stole them. I lied to federal agents. I helped a wanted outlaw evade capture. She looked directly at Senator Morrison, seeing the calculation in his cold eyes. And I'd do it again, because some things are more important than following unjust laws. The prosecutor smiled. They'd prepared for this line of attack, knowing that Emma's honesty about her own crimes would actually strengthen her credibility with the jury. The verdict came 3 days later, guilty on all charges. Senator Morrison was sentenced to life imprisonment, his vast criminal empire dismantled, and his stolen lands returned to territorial ownership. As they left the courthouse, Emma felt a hand on her arm. Jake stood there, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable but determined. I wanted to thank you, he said quietly, for giving Danny's death meaning, for finishing what he started. Emma studied his face, seeing the peace there that had been absent during their desperate flight across the territories. What will you do now? Jake gestured toward Marshall Harrison, who was waiting nearby with official-looking papers. Federal service, hunting down the kind of men I used to be. His smile was rueful. Turns out there's a market for reformed outlaws who know how criminals think. And you're all right with that? Daniel always said the past doesn't have to define the future, as long as you're willing to pay the price for changing. Jake settled his hat back on his head. I figure I owe him at least that much. As Jake walked away to begin his new life in federal service, Emma felt a familiar weight in her satchel. Not Daniel's evidence this time, but letters from families throughout the territories, People who'd heard about the trial and wanted help investigating their own suspicious tragedies. Marshall Harrison had offered her work as well, consulting on cases involving territorial corruption, using her experience with legal documents and her understanding of how powerful men hid their crimes behind legitimate businesses. It wasn't the quiet life she'd once planned with Thomas Brennan, but it was honest work that honored the memory of everyone who died for Senator Morrison's greed. And sometimes, Emma had learned, justice wasn't about finding peace. It was about making sure the fight continued. 6 weeks later, she was on a train heading for Wyoming territory, responding to a letter from a widow whose husband had died under suspicious circumstances involving a mining claim dispute. The work was dangerous, the pay uncertain, and the odds of success often slim. But as the train carried her toward another fight against corruption and murder, Emma Brennan smiled. Daniel Morrison's evidence had done more than convict one criminal. It had shown her a path forward, a way to transform grief and anger into something constructive. Some debts, she'd discovered, were best paid forward. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the Wild West. If this story touched your heart, moved your soul, or kept you on the edge of your seat, I'd be forever grateful if you'd subscribe to my channel and share this tale with someone who loves a good story. Your support means everything to a storyteller's heart, and I can't wait to share more adventures with you soon. The federal courthouse in Denver had become Emma's second home over the past month, but today felt different. Today, the defense was calling their star witness, and everyone knew Senator Morrison was making his final play for freedom. The defense calls Marcus Delacroix to the stand, announced Morrison's attorney, and Emma felt her blood turn to ice. Jake half rose from his seat in the gallery, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun, before Marshall Harrison's restraining touch reminded him where he was. Marcus Delacroix walked into the courtroom like he owned it, dressed in an expensive suit that couldn't quite hide the predator underneath. "Mr. Delacroix," the defense attorney began smoothly, "please tell the court about your encounter with the defendants in the Colorado mountains." Marcus's testimony was a masterpiece of selective truth and calculated lies. He described the cave encounter accurately enough. The storm, the desperate negotiation, the land grant Emma had used to buy their lives. But his version painted them as criminals attempting to bribe an honest working man while casting Senator Morrison as a victim of an elaborate extortion scheme. "Miss Brennan specifically told me that Senator Morrison was dead," Marcus testified, his pale eyes finding Emma's across the courtroom. "She said federal marshals had killed him and that this land grant was all that remained of his estate. When I discovered she'd lied, I felt duty-bound to report the attempted fraud to the proper authorities." Emma watched the jury's faces, seeing doubt creep into their expressions. Marcus was believable, professional, exactly the kind of witness who could plant reasonable doubt in the minds of 12 ordinary citizens. The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal but careful. Federal law prohibited questioning Marcus about his criminal activities without immunity agreements that could compromise other ongoing investigations. "Mr. Delacroix, isn't it true that you were paid $5,000 to hunt down and kill Jake Morrison?" "I was hired to locate Mr. Morrison, yes. Whether he was taken alive or dead was up to him." "And you've been paid additional sums by Senator Morrison for your testimony today?" Marcus's smile was razor thin. "I've been compensated for my time and travel expenses, as is standard for witnesses in federal court." The careful dance of legal language couldn't hide the underlying truth, but it didn't need to. All the defense required was reasonable doubt, and Marcus Delacroix was providing it in measured doses. During the lunch recess, Emma found herself standing in the courthouse corridor with Jake and Marshall Harrison, all three of them grappling with the reality that their carefully built case might be crumbling. "He's good," Harrison admitted grimly. "Better than I expected. The jury's starting to wonder if maybe Morrison really is being framed." Jake's laugh was bitter. Marcus always was a professional. Even when he's lying, he tells enough truth to be convincing. "There has to be something," Emma insisted. "Some way to prove he's working for Morrison, that this is all coordinated." It was Jake who provided the answer, his outlaw's understanding of criminal psychology cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "The land grant," he said suddenly. "Emma, do you still have the original document you gave Marcus?" "Of course not. He kept it when we made the deal." "Then where is it now?" Jake's eyes were bright with sudden hope. If Marcus was really the innocent victim he claims to be, wouldn't he have turned that document over to the authorities as evidence of our attempted bribery? The implications hit Emma like lightning. He still has it. He's planning to use it after the trial. Harrison was already moving, signaling to his deputies. We need a search warrant for Delacroix's hotel room. If we can find that land grant, we prove the whole story was a setup from the beginning, Emma finished. 2 hours later, federal agents discovered the territorial land grant in Marcus Delacroix's hotel room, along with correspondence that revealed the depth of his ongoing relationship with Senator Morrison. The letters detailed payment schedules, operational plans, and most damning of all, instructions for Marcus's courtroom testimony. When court reconvened, the prosecutor was ready. Mr. Delacroix, I show you what's been marked as Federal Exhibit 47. Do you recognize this document? Marcus's composure cracked for the first time as he stared at the land grant he'd thought was safely hidden. That appears to be the fraudulent document Miss Brennan attempted to use as a bribe. The same document you testified you felt duty-bound to report to authorities? Yes. Then why, Mr. Delacroix, was it found in your hotel room this afternoon, along with these letters detailing your ongoing criminal relationship with Senator Morrison? The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus's pale eyes darted toward Morrison, then to the exits, calculating odds and finding no favorable outcomes. I want to speak to my attorney, he said finally. But the damage was done. The jury had seen the evidence, heard the lies exposed, understood the scope of the conspiracy they'd been asked to dismiss as coincidence. Senator Morrison's last hope for acquittal had just destroyed itself on the witness stand. The guilty verdict came down on a cold February morning. But for Emma Brennan, the real victory had come 3 days earlier when Marcus Delacroix agreed to cooperate with federal authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. His confession had opened floodgates of information about territorial corruption that reached far beyond Senator Morrison's land scheme. Names, dates, bank accounts, methods of operation. Marcus had kept meticulous records of his criminal activities, never knowing they would eventually serve as evidence against his former employers. 15 separate murders, Marshal Harrison reported as he spread the documentation across his office desk, all disguised as accidents, suicides, or random violence. The Morrison organization has been operating like this for nearly a decade. Emma studied the list of victims, recognizing some names from Daniel's original investigation, but horrified by the scope of the conspiracy. Ranchers, homesteaders, territorial officials, even a federal judge who'd gotten too close to the truth, all dead because they'd stood between Senator Morrison and his vision of territorial domination. What happens to Marcus? She asked. 25 years in federal prison, eligible for parole in 15. Harrison's expression was grim. It's not justice for 15 murders, but his cooperation will help us prosecute at least 30 other criminals throughout the territories. Jake looked up from the witness statements he'd been reviewing. And Morrison? Life imprisonment, no possibility of parole. Harrison allowed himself a small smile. The judge was very clear about that. Morrison's own testimony during sentencing sealed his fate. Emma remembered Morrison's final court appearance, the way he'd stood before the judge with the arrogance of a man who still believed his political connections would save him. His refusal to show remorse, his insistence that everything he'd done was justified by the needs of territorial development, had convinced even his own attorneys that he was beyond redemption. There's something else, Harrison continued, withdrawing another document from his files. The territorial governor has decided to honor Daniel Morrison posthumously. Full pardon for all criminal activities, recognition as a federal informant who died in service to justice. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. After 3 years of carrying guilt over his brother's death, after months of believing Daniel had died as just another outlaw, the official recognition of his sacrifice was almost overwhelming. He'd have liked that, Jake said finally, his voice rough with emotion. Danny always wanted to do the right thing, even when it got him killed. Emma watched Jake struggle with feelings he'd kept buried since that terrible day in Tombstone. The trial had given Daniel's death legal meaning, but this official recognition gave it something more precious. Honor. There's an offer that comes with the pardon, Harrison added. The territorial government wants to establish a special investigative unit to handle cases of corruption and organized crime. They're offering you the position of chief investigator. The proposal was everything Jake had never dared hope for: a chance to use his outlaw knowledge in service of justice, official recognition of his reformed status, and a salary that would allow him to build the kind of life Daniel had dreamed of. "What about the bounty?" Jake asked. $5,000 is still a lot of money. "Officially vacated as of this morning," Harrison replied, "along with all outstanding warrants for Jake Morrison's arrest. As far as the law is concerned, you're a clean slate." Emma felt something shift in her chest as she watched Jake process the offer. They'd spent months running together, fighting together, building something between them that neither of them had been willing to name. Now, with their mission accomplished and their lives no longer in immediate danger, the future was suddenly full of possibilities. "What about you?" Jake asked her. "Harrison offered you that consulting position." Emma had been thinking about Marshall Harrison's offer for weeks, traveling throughout the territories, investigating corruption cases, using her legal knowledge and investigative skills to help federal law enforcement build cases against criminals like Morrison. It was dangerous work, but it was also meaningful work. Every corrupt official prosecuted, every criminal conspiracy exposed, would honor the memory of everyone who died for Senator Morrison's greed. "I'm going to take it," she said finally. "Someone needs to speak for the victims, make sure their stories are heard." Jake nodded slowly, understanding more than she'd put into words. They'd both found their callings in the ashes of tragedy. Discovered purposes worth the risks involved. "So we're both going to be federal agents," he said with a slight smile. Danny would have gotten a real kick out of that. Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Actually, there's one more thing. The Territorial Investigation Unit will be based here in Denver, and Miss Brennan's consulting work will be coordinated through this office as well." The implication was clear. They'd be working together at least some of the time. Given the feelings that had been building between them during their desperate flight across the territories, the arrangement had possibilities that went far beyond professional cooperation. "Partners?" Jake asked, extending his hand to Emma. "Partners," she agreed, taking his hand and feeling the calluses earned through months of honest work. As they shook hands in Marshall Harrison's office, Emma realized their story was ending where it began, with a partnership forged in necessity, but sustained by something deeper. Justice, it turned out, was just the beginning. Spring came early to Colorado territory that year, and with it, Emma Brennan's first assignment as a federal consulting investigator. A suspicious land dispute in the mining camps north of Colorado Springs that bore uncomfortable similarities to Senator Morrison's schemes. She stood on the platform of the Denver railway station, checking her travel documents one final time before boarding the northbound train. 6 months of federal work had taught her to prepare for anything, and her traveling kit now included a badge, a gun she actually knew how to use, and enough legal authority to make territorial officials very nervous. "Ready for another adventure?" Jake Morrison appeared beside her, carrying his own travel bag and wearing the badge of a territorial chief investigator. Their partnership had evolved over the winter months from necessity to choice, from professional cooperation to something deeper and more personal. They'd worked 3 cases together already, each one building trust and understanding between two people who'd learned to read each other's thoughts in situations where mistakes meant death. According to the complaint, 5 mining families have sold their claims under suspicious circumstances, Emma said, handing him the case file. "All to the same shell company, all within the past 2 months." Jake scanned the documentation, his trained eye picking out the patterns that marked organized criminal activity. Payment amounts are identical, signatures look too similar, and the notary public dates don't match the territorial records. Plus 2 of the sellers have disappeared entirely, and a third was found dead in what the local sheriff called a mining accident. Emma's tone carried the skepticism she'd developed for any unexplained deaths in territorial land disputes. The train whistle sounded, and they climbed aboard the federal car that Marshall Harrison had arranged for their exclusive use. As Colorado's mountains rolled past the windows, Emma reflected on how much her life had changed since that desperate night when she'd first knocked on Jake Morrison's cabin door. She'd found justice for Daniel Morrison and the murdered Homestead families, but she'd also found something she hadn't expected: a sense of purpose that went far beyond personal revenge. Every case they solved, every criminal they exposed, made the territories a little safer for honest families trying to build better lives. "Penny for your thoughts?" Jake asked, settling into the seat across from her arm. "Just thinking about how far we've come," Emma replied. "6 months ago, we were fugitives running for our lives. Now we're federal agents with enough authority to make territorial governors nervous." Jake's smile was warm, genuine, the expression of a man who'd found peace with his past and hope for his future. Daniel would have loved this. Two reformed criminals using everything they learned from the wrong side of the law to help honest people. The mention of Daniel no longer brought pain, just a quiet satisfaction that his sacrifice had meaning beyond his own death. Every corrupt official they prosecuted, every criminal conspiracy they exposed, was another way of honoring his memory. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you," Jake said, his tone suddenly serious. Emma felt her heart speed up, recognizing the shift in his demeanor that meant important conversations were coming. Over the months, they'd grown skilled at reading each other's moods and intentions. "When this case is finished," Jake continued, "Marshal Harrison's offered me a permanent position with federal law enforcement. Good salary, steady work, a chance to make a real difference." "That's wonderful," Emma said, though something in his tone warned her there was more coming. "The position's based in Washington, D.C., federal oversight of territorial law enforcement, coordination with other agencies." Jake met her eyes directly. "It's everything I never thought I'd be qualified for." The implication hit her like cold water. Washington was 2,000 miles from Denver, from the territories where her own work was concentrated, from the life they'd been building together. "You're going to take it," she said quietly. "I don't know." Jake's honesty was one of the things she'd come to love about him. "It depends on whether there's a reason to stay." The question hung between them, unspoken but clearly understood. Their partnership had been forged in crisis and strengthened through shared danger, but they'd never discussed what it might become in peacetime. "Jake," Emma began, then stopped, unsure how to put into words the feelings that had been growing for months. The train rounded a curve, and suddenly the mining town of Cedar Falls was visible in the valley below. Wooden buildings, muddy streets, and the kind of rough frontier community where criminals thrived and honest people struggled to survive. "We should focus on the case," Emma said finally, taking refuge in professional duty. "People are depending on us." Jake nodded, but his eyes held disappointment along with understanding. "Of course, the case comes first." As they gathered their gear and prepared to disembark, Emma realized they were approaching more than just another investigation. Cedar Falls would test not only their professional skills, but also the personal partnership they'd built, and whatever future they might have together. 2 hours later, they stood in the cemetery behind Cedar Falls' small church, looking down at the grave of Thomas McKenna, the third mining family head, whose death had been ruled accidental. "Crushed by falling timber," the local sheriff had explained, "happens all the time in the mines." But the grave's location in consecrated ground reserved for church members suggested the community hadn't accepted the official explanation. Accident victims weren't usually buried with such ceremony. "Someone cared enough to give him a proper funeral," Emma observed. "Someone who didn't believe the sheriff's story," Jake added. "Question is, are they brave enough to talk to federal agents?" As if summoned by his words, an elderly woman approached from the church, her black dress and careful movements marking her as someone in mourning. "You're the investigators from Denver," she said without preamble. "I'm Martha McKenna. Thomas was my son." Emma felt the familiar surge of purpose that came with meeting people who needed justice but had no power to demand it. This was why she'd chosen federal work over the quiet life she might have built, because someone had to speak for victims like Thomas McKenna. "Mrs. McKenna," Emma said gently, "we're here to find the truth about what happened to your son." The woman's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "Then you'd better come inside. I've been waiting months for someone to ask the right questions." As they followed Martha McKenna toward the church, Jake caught Emma's hand briefly, a gesture of support and partnership that reminded her why their work mattered and why the future they were building together was worth fighting for. Some stories, Emma realized, were just beginning.